Welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Matthew Kaemingk.
I'm Shadi Hamid.
Together we research politics, religion, and the future of democracy at Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life.
We are writing a book together. This podcast represents an informal space where we can talk about how to live with deep difference. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey friends, welcome back to Zealots at the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Matthew Kaemingk, and with me is Dr. Shadi Hamid. Together we research politics, religion, and the future of democracy at Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. We're writing a book together on this topic, and this podcast represents a place where, an informal space where we can work out our ideas, talk about these things, and wrestle with what it means to live amidst deep difference. So, for those of you who are new to the show, please do subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Please share and like us and give us 5 stars and A pluses and all of those things. Feel free to reach out and talk with us on Twitter. We're going to share all that information at the end of the podcast. But Shadi, you are working right now on an article that's reflecting on this past week's momentous events around Donald Trump and the attack, and we wanted to have some time to process the event itself, but I think more importantly, Donald Trump's reflections on these things, and really America's reflections on this attack. And I understand you're working on an article processing those things, and hopefully we can wrestle a bit today talking about that. So why don't you share a little bit, just about the event itself and how you process that. I was actually camping with my kids over the weekend, so I came back and flipped on the news and saw that this had happened. Yeah,
you didn't know that it had happened?
No, I was in the mountains outside of Seattle. You can see my Seattle artwork here back here. So I was out of cell phone range. I had no idea, and then come back and you send me this story. I'm like, what? Donald Trump was shot?
So until you saw my text, you didn't know there was an assassination attempt on the former president?
I had no idea. I was in the bliss of fishing and out in wilderness.
Wow,
and you were the one who told me
what that must have been like to kind of come back to that. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the image was the red blood on his face, and I had no idea what it was or what was going on. So yeah, it was quite a shock to go through my news feed and figure out what had happened. Yeah, wild.
Yeah, so I do have a column coming out on this. By the time you all, dear listeners and viewers, experience this, it will be out. So we'll include a link to that column in the Washington Post in the show notes. So feel free to give it a read, and would be interested if folks have any thoughts. It's going to be controversial, perhaps, but I have been thinking a lot about the religious implications of the attempt on Trump's life and whether a near-death experience can cause a change of heart. And I know this might be a fantasy because Trump is someone who seems so stubbornly resistant to change, someone who has been who he is for such a long time. How could he really be a different person, but not even a different person, even something more modest than that? Could he have even a modest change of heart, and one that we could experience in his political behavior and the words that he says in the speeches and rallies that we're going to see in the coming weeks and months? And if he becomes president, which in my view is increasingly likely, could it lead to a different style of governing? And again, that doesn't mean that he's not going to have policies that especially Democrats find abhorrent. He's still going to be a Republican president if he wins. But it's more about whether or not he can govern in a way that is less authoritarian, less brazenly alienating, in a way that actually treats Democrats and his opponents as Americans and not treating them as enemies to be vanquished. So that's kind of the fantasy. And I want to be clear that I don't necessarily think this is likely, but I think there is some use in fantasizing about better futures. That we're so used to being down and depressed about our politics for legitimate reasons, especially after Biden's disastrous debate performance. You know, for anyone who was hoping that Biden would win, obviously that seems less likely now because of that. So I think that there's a sense, you know, especially here in DC, a downcast mood. I want to do something
Would this
different.
be the opposite of catastrophizing in your mind, fantasizing?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, actually. Yeah. And look, I think there's also a personal element here. I've always been fascinated by the idea of conversion stories. And I'm sure anyone who works on religion is going to find that compelling in some way, because that's what religion is supposed to do. Religion at its best is supposed to take sinners and criminals and people who seem forsaken by God at one moment, and then something in them changes. And I was also, there's a local imam of ours in DC. He was giving a talk just a few weeks back, and he was talking about his own conversion story. And there's this idea of maybe someone experiences the Quran, or I think in this particular case, a friend had given him a copy of the Quran, and then he read a certain chapter of the Quran, and something just clicked. And this idea of a very sudden shift, that you might be someone who is just not interested in religion or spirituality at all, but somehow something breaks through the resistance and the barriers. And obviously Trump is someone who has considerable resistance and barriers to religion. He's not a religious person. And in fact, he's probably the most secular president in American history, somewhat ironically. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm at on some of this. And I can say more about why I'm intrigued by the possibility of him changing. And the cool thing here is that I actually have no idea, Matt, where you're at on this. Yeah. You did say something to me over text before this. You're like, Shadi, I think I disagree with you on this, brother. So, hey, I'm ready.
Yeah. No, I think we will have some disagreement. Of course, you're kind of hedging yourself as saying, like, maybe I'm fantasizing. But there's a number of things I want to get to today. Not just, of course, I want to talk about, has Donald Trump changed? Will Donald Trump change? And then sort of what might a religious conversion look like for him? But I think there's another thing that I see going on now related to how evangelicals, Christians who love Donald Trump, are theologically processing the assassination attempt. So they're starting to say things like God saved him, that God is protecting him. Bannon said he has the armor of God on him. So there's ways that we theologize political events, and we sort of read God's movements and God's intentions through these things. Of course, the counter side of it is, if Donald Trump had been killed, would that have been God's will? So,
well, presumably everything that happens is God's will in some way.
According to some, I think that's another thing we can talk about. But I also want to get to how people theologically process moments like this, and where they sort of say, oh, God clearly wants this or doesn't want that, and things like that. But yeah, no, I'm very skeptical about Donald Trump's transformation through this event for a wide variety of sort of practical reasons, but also Christian theological reasons that we can talk through in terms of how Christians think about how change happens. And I'm interested to hear from you a little bit more on the Muslim side. How does a change of heart happen? Is it primarily through divine action? Like, does God change us, or do we change ourselves? Is it something that's instant, or is it a long process? what sorts of things do you have to do to change? I mean, Christianity has a long history of thinking about, those kinds of questions. And I'd be really curious, if you're, say you were wanting to change spiritually and you went to your imam, what kind of advice would your imam give you? I can articulate what that would look like for my pastor, right? If I go to my pastor and say, hey, I'm really struggling with X or Y or Z, and I just can't seem to change my heart, what do I do? That, Christians have a set of things that they would do. And Donald Trump, as I'm seeing, him start to articulate himself, the sorts of things that he's saying do not line up with how Christians have historically thought about transformation. At times he talks about God being involved in the shooting, and at other times he just kind of talks about himself, that like, wow, look at me, I turned my head, and isn't that a great coincidence? Right? And at other points he says, no, I shouldn't be here, and God's not a very active agent in his comments, but also even his comments about his speech that he's about to give. When is he giving his nomination speech? Is that going to be on Thursday?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have the speech in hand, but, he says, I had this speech planned for the convention, and it was going to be really hard-hitting, but it was going to be a great speech. And we threw it away because it wouldn't be the right tone to have a hard-hitting speech against Biden and all of my enemies. And so he's like, we really need to have this sort of new unity and tone with our country. But then he immediately says, but the Democrats might change that, and we might be back to fighting real soon. So he's not signaling an internal transformation. In the Christian tradition, a transformation begins with an acknowledgement of sin, an acknowledgement that I was on the wrong path. I am a sinner in need of grace. And Donald Trump has said nothing about I am a sinner. I need to change my ways. This is unacceptable. I need God, a sort of articulation of my need for God, rather than God did this thing for me. And it's similarly with his followers. It is God has given him armor, God has blessed him, God has protected him. None of them are saying God needs to change his heart in that kind of a way.
Yeah.
Of course,
okay.
There are other. Let me edit that just a little bit, because there are evangelical Republicans who will say, I don't think Donald Trump is a good man. I don't think he's a good Christian. Many of them doubt his faith. But they'll say sort of like, he's a necessary evil.
Or a flawed vessel.
Yeah, he's a flawed vessel or something like that. And I hope that he can change. But I'm talking about his ardent followers who go along with Donald Trump's feeling about God protects Trump, God blesses Trump, God is with Trump. But there's no language of a need for internal transformation, humility, confession, lament. All of those kinds of words are central to the Christian understanding of transformation. To have the transformation that you're, fantasizing about, as you say, you got to name those things, and he's not doing that. And so that's, as a Christian, that's why I'm thinking about that. So anyways, I'm not sure where to start. You go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of follow-up questions. I do want to just, for listeners and viewers, just share a little bit more about what Trump has said.
Yeah.
So on social media, the day after the attempt, he said, quote, "It was God alone who prevented the unthinkable from happening." That was his first, I believe, signaling of God's role in all of this. And in a later conversation with reporters, he talked about the chance and really the luck of the moment, because if you watch the video of what happened, Trump tilts his head slightly just before shots ring out. So if he hadn't have done that, the bullet may have very well hit him. So this is what Trump says as he reflects on this. Quote, "If I only half turn, it hits the back of the brain. The other way goes right through the skull. And because the sign was high, I'm looking up. The chances of my making a perfect turn are probably 1/10 of 1%. And then his conclusion, he says, quote, "I'm not supposed to be here." And we can maybe unpack that too, because what does it really mean for someone? I'm curious about the theological implications of someone saying, "I'm not supposed to be here," because if you're here, then again, presumably it's God's will that you're here and that you are supposed to be there, and so on.
They're mutually contradictory statements, right? God saved me and I'm not supposed to be here. You can't, those two things can't both be true.
Yeah, but also this is not someone who's very theologically well read. So let's cut him some slack. So it's interesting. I'll just say one more thing about how he talks about changing his speech at the Republican convention.
Yeah.
He kind of emphasizes that this was going to be like a barn burner, or I think the word he used was a humdinger of a speech. It was going to be brutal against Democrats. And then he displays this level of self-awareness where he says, "I'm not going to do that because, quote, I think it would be very bad if I got up and started going wild about how horrible everybody is and how corrupt and crooked, even if it's true." End quote. I mean, this actually is impressive to me because Trump, I think, actually has more self-awareness than people give him credit for. Like, he knows how he's perceived, and he knows the kind of performative aspect of what he does. And he's sort of acknowledging that here and saying, well, actually, I'm not going to do that. So there's a sort of self-consciousness here that is either encouraging or troubling, depending on how you look at it. But I think you're right, Matt, that there's no sense of acknowledgement that he had lost his way, that he had maybe gone too far in the past, or that he's really reckoning in a deeper way. Again, it's early days. And again, this is why I think fantasizing is an interesting exercise, because then we can start to imagine what maybe not a transformation, but something more modest, like a change of heart, might actually look like. And then we can sort of track whether or not he's moving in that direction and hold him accountable. So I take your point that the signs that a Christian would look for are not there, but we can look at it from a Christian theological perspective, or we can look at it just from the secular idea of a near-death experience, that when people have a brush with mortality, it does focus the mind. It does force them to prioritize some things rather than others. As they think more about death, or maybe even, who knows, the afterlife, although I don't think Trump has really given much indication that he believes literally in the prospect of, I don't know. This is actually something that I'd be interested to look at a little bit more, to what extent he's actually addressed that. But when we do get closer to death, and there's also this idea, this trope in literature, but also in real life, of the deathbed conversion story. Yeah. That when you're really close to death, when you know it's going to happen, when you have, say, a terminal illness or something like that, that's a moment in which people could be like, hey, I gotta do this. I gotta talk to God more. I gotta pray, because if there is going to be an afterlife, if there is going to be some kind of reckoning, this is my last shot. So short of a Christian transformation, it just might be that something like, hey, Trump is thinking more about his legacy, and he's thinking about how he might want to redeem his legacy, how he wants to be remembered, that he just doesn't have much time left. Because I think there's always been a sense with Trump of his own, he's not someone who acts like he has any sense of his own impending death. Like, there's almost like this sense that he could live forever. Like the fact that he just eats like McDonald's and
he eats
burgers.
McDonald's. He tans himself. He hangs out with young women.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to exercise at all. There's no sense of, he plays golf, which is not really like a real sport. You know, okay,
Come
guys,
on,
don't, I
Come
mean,
on, man.
people are going to, I don't know if there's podcast listeners who feel strongly about that, but yeah.
But I mean, the near death experience, I think can be catalytic for change. But I think in terms of how Christians think about how people change, it's not so much just isolated experiences, but it would be a series, a community of practice that is different. And the fact that he jumps right back into the campaign and he's surrounded by a lot of people who are not, let's just say, walking closely with Jesus. He's involved in the heat of a political campaign, and fighting for office and fighting against people that he disagrees with. That kind of environment is not conducive to daily prayer, confession, conversation, being mentored in the faith. And those are all really important aspects of how Christians think change happens. It's not just an individual moment. And this might be part of the problem for evangelicalism within the history of the Christian faith, because for evangelicals, the moment of conversion is a very important thing, and the stories that we share about that moment of meeting Jesus is really important. But for the history of the Christian faith, it's not so much that Christians are born at a moment, but that they are made over time through study and worship and community and meals, and it's over time that you learn to follow Jesus and you learn to put those things into practice. And so that's what makes me sort of skeptical that even if he were to have a very close encounter that was disruptive of his sense of I'm infinite, I'm immortal, he's surrounded by people who are treating him like he's immortal. And so it's hard to think about your own mortality when everyone is treating you like a god, or that you have the armor of God or God's blessing or God's protection. That doesn't really prepare you well to be on your knees. We've talked about the politics of prayer in the past, and the Islamic practice of prayer where you're like on your face, and that's that sort of posture of submission, right, is something Donald Trump would have to assume, and
the idea of Trump
it would be miraculous, right?
Yeah. But and the idea of Trump submitting himself to a higher authority, I think that's the really challenging thing. He would have to put something else above him and his own interests. And this is why Trump is sort of a kind of politically idolatrous figure, because he becomes the focal point of hope and aspiration for many of his followers. And he becomes to see himself as a kind of savior-like figure. And he memorably said in the 2016 campaign, "I alone can fix it." That's not the kind of thing that a God-conscious person would say. And it just is, I think, unfortunate that there aren't people in Trump's community of followers and supporters. You'd think that there would be evangelical, preachers or even theologians, because a lot of evangelicals obviously, staunchly support Trump, that they could be there to help guide him in this moment. But, as we've talked about in our episode with Russell Moore, the evangelical supporters of Trump are thinking primarily about politics and not theology, and they're thinking primarily about winning. and not necessarily about the place of Christ in this political universe. So that just seems like a missed opportunity. Like, I wish there were better people around him, even just a sprinkling of them.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one other term or element I want to introduce in here because I think it's really important this will be helpful to understand how Donald Trump is articulating himself and then how sort of American Christians are processing this. It's a term from a sociologist, Christian Smith, who introduced this term of what he called moral therapeutic deism. And he argued that this is sort of a dominant faith within America that is sort of, you might say it's parasitic off of Christianity. It sort of smells a little bit like Christianity, but it's not. So the term, once again, moral therapeutic deism. And it has sort of three tenets that go along with it. The moral is you need to be a good person. Try to be a good person. The therapeutic is the importance of feeling whole and feeling happy and living sort of a fulfilled life. So be a good person, be emotionally healthy. And then deism is there is a God. He's kind of distant. He wants you to be good and he wants you to be happy. And he helps you in times of emergency. So he's a little bit like a 911 Santa Claus, if you will. So when you're in trouble and if you ask nicely, he will help you. So you want to live a good life. You want to live a happy life. You want to be true to yourself and God, that's what God wants for you. And God will help you. So the way that this differs from Christianity, and there's many ways that it differs from Christianity, is one is moral therapeutic deism does not seek a deep heart transformation. There's no sense of confession. Moreover, there's no cross where Jesus dies for your sins and you live in and for Jesus. In moral therapeutic deism, God is kind of a distant helper. And so we see that in how Donald Trump talks about these things, right? That God protected him in this sort of emergency moment. Similarly, for a lot of American Christians talking about that, they speak about God as a protector, but not as someone who might completely transform Donald Trump's life or his heart. And so that's the difference between a moral therapeutic deism and a Christian understanding. So coming out of this experience, being a moral therapeutic deist, here's what Donald Trump would say: I want to try and be more moral. I want to try and be more truly myself. So it's more a sense of self-actualization. I want to be my best self.
Yeah.
Right? Which that's very different from the Christian call, right? Christians
Sure,
are
Matt,
not.
that's better, but that's still better than the alternative. I get that this is not
Yes,
the Christian
it is.
ideal, but that would be amazing if he was like, I want to be my best self. It sounds like trite and corny, and I can't imagine him actually saying it, but we'd be like, oh my God, did Trump actually say that? That's amazing.
Okay. You are absolutely right. No, like it would be much better to live in a world of moral therapeutic deists than to live in a world of narcissistic megalomaniacs. Yes.
But I guess you could also make the argument that maybe moral therapeutic deism, it aspires to being better, and it sounds like it might lead to that. But if it doesn't have the kind of strong Christian or even, Muslim or Jewish foundations, like it's not based on something theologically grounded, that the fruit that comes out of it will be not necessarily rotten, but not quite ripe either.
Okay, so I take your point. I think that's absolutely right. Like we should be grateful and happy if Donald Trump were to say, I want to be a better person. I want to be more moral. I want to be my best self or live my best life or whatever.
Live my truth.
Yeah, live my truth, live, laugh, love, right? That would be preferable. That said, okay, now I'm going to push again. What's politically dangerous about a particular version of moral therapeutic deism is when you say God God is with me. So when you start saying this is God's man. He is God's marked man. He's the man of manifest destiny. Was it Ross who just wrote about, Trump as a man of destiny? That in the Times. When you start to say Donald Trump is a man of destiny. He's God's man. He's protected by God. Then it's impossible to criticize. It's impossible to check. It's impossible. All of these sorts of things. And that's the real danger of this moral therapeutic deism, is that it's not just I'm trying to be a good man, but God is making me a good man.
Yeah, but is there something different between being a man of destiny and being God's man? I haven't read the piece that you're referencing, but what does it even mean to be a man of destiny? I guess that's itself a sort of mystery. I am reminded of the Quranic verse, "No one knows the soldiers of God but God," which is sort of an admonition to be modest about our claims that human beings are sort of raised or protected by God, or that we can be sure that that's the case, that there's the only one who can truly judge that is God himself. And for us to sort of assume that on behalf of God is itself a potentially dangerous move. Because once you start saying that certain individuals are channeling God through them or have God's armor, then of course we know what can result, that almost anything can be justified. So I think we always have to be careful, because our judgment is often weak. We are mere mortals, and for it's just a big claim to make. And yeah, so I mean, all those things that you mentioned, I hadn't heard about the Steve Bannon comment about God's armor, although that's precisely the sort of thing you would expect him to say.
Yeah.
But it's scary.
I want to put back on, I said I wanted to hear more about the Islamic understanding of transformation. So I don't know exactly how to intro this, but, if you were to go to your imam and say, my heart is a mess. I want the wrong things. I desire the wrong things. What sorts of advice might you get from, your, Muslim mentors or the Quran or the Hadith about the change of the heart? How might a heart change? Is that effort? Is that reading? Is that prayer? Is that what would the ingredients be in an Islamic transformative process?
Well, look, the first thing I'll say is, I'm very much intrigued by this question of how change occurs within individuals, in part because, I've tried to become, more religious and more serious about my practice, in recent years. And so I've had to sort of contend with this in my own life of how is progress made? What does progress look like? There's also the more, I think, maybe a different kind of question about what does it really mean to be more practicing. Obviously, there is the kind of required rituals in Islam that kind of go without saying, but obviously that's just a kind of minimum floor. And to be spiritual means to go beyond just ritual, because, there's obviously people who do ritual, but then it's not reflected in their behavior and it doesn't seem to actually make inroads into their own hearts. So there's one thing that I just heard from actually the imam that I mentioned earlier, that he said that stood out to me recently. I think this is from a hadith that it's something to the effect that imagine a mother and a child. And the mother is obviously merciful and forgiving towards her child, even if, her child does, bad things and isn't, ideal. We're all flawed, all of that. But a mother has a certain kind of protective nature where she's going to give a lot of grace for her child and love her child, even if her child does things that she doesn't like. And then, so I think the Hadith is along the lines of, well, imagine that. God is multiple times, I forget what the exact number is or if it's even that, but God is so much more merciful to his creation than a mother is to her child. So take that and multiply it exponentially, and it's a kind of a limitless multiplication because God is infinite, so his mercy has no limits. And so when we start each verse of each chapter of the Quran with in the name of God, the most merciful, when we say God is the most merciful, we're saying that we're trying to give an approximation to something that is very hard to approximate. Like, what does it mean to be the most merciful? What does it mean to have limitless mercy? And this is something that I think has been really important for me because, sometimes we grow up with the idea that we hear about God's punishment so much. And obviously this was also a topic of a previous episode on the role of hell, which, I would strongly recommend people go back to if you're interested in this side of it. But I heard a lot about hell. And when you hear about God's punishment, yes, that's important. Yes, that has to play a role in theology and our understanding of salvation. But when we're conditioned to thinking about God's punishment, then there's a risk that we start to lose faith in the possibility of mercy and forgiveness. So this particular this hadith, I think, is really important in kind of reminding us that no matter how bad you've been, no matter how far away from the straight path you've found yourself, there is no limit. So there's never a point where you've lost the possibility of God's mercy. And I think that people who are, stuck in a cycle of sin, sometimes they can just be like, I'm hopeless. I have no way out. God will never look kindly upon me again. I've lost him. He's out of my life. And then, there's also this sense in Islam that the devil comes and tells us that it's the devil in a sort of an interesting and maybe even counterintuitive way is trying to convince us that we have no path for forgiveness. So it's not God who's telling us this kind of punishing, the self-punishing aspect is actually not coming from God. It's coming from the devil. The devil wants us to lose hope, and he wants us to stay on the crooked path as long as we can. So I think I think the first step is having hope. And this, I think, applies to Trump in a very useful way. It applies to people, criminals or people who we think are just really beyond God's grace. And we also have any number of stories in the founding of Islam where obviously no one is Muslim in the beginning. People have to convert. And so in Mecca, the Prophet and the early converts, they give a lot of grace to Meccans who, at least in the beginning, are opponents of Islam and they're fighting Islam. And then because obviously those are the pool of converts. So if you're saying that if everyone who opposes us is beyond redemption, then you're going to have no one who's able to join your faith. So by definition, if a young religion wants to grow and expand, it has to have a posture of openness and forgiveness towards its enemies. There's no other way.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are very important political aspects to this if you believe in divine mercy and the power of God to change people. I mean, the one that clearly comes to mind and is used quite often is in terms of capital punishment, right? Should the state kill people? And Christians who are against capital punishment will often talk about how God can save anyone. No one is beyond God's mercy. The game is not over until the moment of death. And so that particular doctrine is used in Christian legal arguments about the death penalty. Similarly, you and I talk a lot about the fate of democracy in the United States and the ways in which we talk about people as beyond the pale and really beyond salvation, right? So as American politics are becoming more and more apocalyptic, or sort of this tribal politics, a clash between pure good and pure evil, you imagine your opponents, the Democrats or the Republicans, as being beyond salvation, beyond transformation. And there's something really dangerous if you give up that hope of persuasion, of conversion, of whatever it is, because, right, if these people are beyond persuasion, if they're beyond persuasion, then the only way that I quote unquote solve them is I kill them. And so in this moment of political violence, without that level of hope, I think democracy requires a hope of change. Even if you're wrong, right, about your faith or their faith or whatever else, democracy requires citizens who have some kind of hope and persuasion. Because if there is no hope for persuasion, then all you have is raw power.
Yes.
All that's left is coercion. And all of this starts, if we go all the way back, is the mother and her child being merciful. That's sort of an understanding of divine mercy. That divine mercy, a belief in divine mercy, is a resource for democratic life, right? Because if God can change Donald Trump, then I can keep debating with him, right? But if God can't change Donald Trump, then there's nothing left but just to defeat or kill, right?
Yes, that's really important. The point about death row conversions, it's really important, but it also reminds me of a hadith. It's kind of similar, where there's a murderer, and he's killed 99 people, but he's considering, he feels kind of bad, and he's wondering if he can repent. So he's on this journey, presumably somewhere in the desert, and he's walking towards a village where there's going to be a monk or a religious type figure where he can kind of like explore this. And basically what ends up happening is that he himself dies halfway on the way to this village. So the angels and the devil, the angels and
The demons.
Oh yeah. There's okay, yeah. The angels of mercy and the angels of punishment. To kind of to simplify, they're quarreling amongst themselves about who takes him, basically. And he's in the midway point on the way to the village. So then God steps in and actually moves the point so that he's actually past halfway to the village. And this is sort of the idea that God can step in even if there's these kinds of borderline cases, and even someone who has had this very long history of killing a lot of people, once they sort of implant this desire for change. And this is maybe gets back to some of the earlier points about there has to be an openness in your heart. You have to actually make the first step. So you move towards God, and then God will move mountains towards you. So there is a sort of sense of that first step, and it can be a very modest one because this guy hasn't really done much good. All he's done is he's moving towards the possibility of good. But even that, allows him a possibility of redemption. And again, like, these things aren't necessarily meant to be taken 100% literally, but they are, I think, meant to be messages to us to give us hope. Again, like this idea that we're not forsaken by God, that we are not condemned, and we shouldn't condemn ourselves. And that is, I think, really at the heart of some of the Catholic arguments against the death penalty, which we did talk about also in a previous episode in a previous season with Elizabeth Bruenig. But I think this is what's missing with Donald Trump, to bring it back to that. And I think this is your objection, like earlier on in this conversation, Matt, that there's no sign that he's really decided to move towards God. He hasn't necessarily taken that step. Again, but we don't really know what is in the hearts of men, and God works in mysterious ways and all of that. And, this sort of raises a question, I think, that let's say Trump, that I'll put to you, Matt, let's say Trump isn't going to go through a transformation of the Christian sort that you talked about. Let's say he is just that, a flawed vessel. But a flawed vessel can still be part of God's plan. And can you say a little bit more about the flawed vessel argument? Because I think that's one that we hear a lot, but I'm not totally sure how it works.
Sure, yeah. I think the basic understanding is, if you look through the Bible, the people of Israel encounter lots of pagan nations and pagan kings. And there's an articulation of God moving through history and actually moving through pagan powers to fulfill God's purposes. And so God can use anyone he wants to pursue his purposes. And so within the context of Donald Trump and American Christianity, you do have the Christians who just think Donald Trump is wonderful and he's amazing and he's God's man. But then you have other evangelicals think, no, Donald Trump is very flawed. He's very fallen. He doesn't smell like Jesus in any way, shape, or form. But God is somehow using him to do things like Supreme Court justices and things like that. And so he's a flawed vessel that God is using. But both of these are a type of what's called natural theology, which is that you read God into events through the world. So you believe that you can name God's actions and God's will. So with great confidence, you say, this is clearly God's vessel. And like I said at the very beginning of our discussion, what if Donald Trump had died? Does that mean that he wasn't God's man? So reading history is very tricky in those kinds of ways. But that's the basic thing of the flawed vessel theology.
Okay. Yeah. It's also worth noting that God's people suffer, that or have been, killed, quote unquote, before their time. And that itself is an interesting way that people put it.
Right. So when Donald Trump was convicted, when he became a convicted felon, then they would say, well, Jesus was a convicted felon. So Donald Trump is like Jesus. Right.
Oh.
So no matter what happens to Donald Trump,
it's unfalsifiable.
Yeah. So if he were killed, then they would say
he was a martyr.
Donald Trump is a martyr for God, right? So, and if he's saved, it's God saved him. So right. So that's the trick with natural theology, is that it becomes an internal system, and the Bible can't penetrate it. So you just because you are reading God out of history rather than reading God out of Scripture. And so you develop a political theology that is impenetrable. And that's extremely dangerous. And so with moral therapeutic deism, there's no scripture that can penetrate it. It is just be a good person in the way that you think being good is, like live a happy whole life in however you define that. And then, pray to this God who might help you in emergencies. There's no outside scripture that can convict or transform you.
Yeah. And maybe I think, just thinking about it from like a Muslim perspective, I think the other thing that I would add about how we save our own hearts, or how to open up our hearts. I mean, the role of ritual is important. Maybe this is one contrast with Christianity, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are on this. That at some level you have to, obviously there's rituals that Christians can do, but I think that there's much more of a focus in Islam that to open up your heart, it's hard to do that if you're not upholding the 5 daily prayers. If you're not upholding the law, then that will create a barrier between you and God, and it will darken your heart. So the first step, if you want to have your heart open to the possibilities of something more, the first thing that you can do before anything else is you just do things, you just do the work, so to speak, that there is no substitute for doing the work. Like at some point, you just got to do stuff, and that can require a lot of willpower. And at some point, and that in some ways, that's, I think, encouraging and refreshing, because it does put a lot of agency onto the individual, that anyone can wake up.
Yeah. Like okay. So Shadi, our Christian listeners right now are just like the hairs on the back of their necks.
Oh God,
going up.
What did I do?
It's just fine. You're doing fine, man. You're doing fine. But for Christians, you said like to save your own heart or to open up your own heart. These are things that Christians would not say we can do.
Okay, so maybe save, the word save, I guess, is a trigger. Maybe that.
Yeah. No, but and earlier when you told that hadith, you said we need to make the first move and then God will respond to us. Whereas for the Christian faith, it's flipped. It's actually God makes the first move. So Augustine, he would say, I don't want to do the good, but I want to do the good. That makes sense. Like he knows, like within his own heart, he wants to steal. He wants to sleep around. He wants to, he wants to be selfish. He says, I know my heart is messed up.
And he has that famous quote too, oh God, make me chaste, but not yet.
Yes, exactly. So that's it, right? So like, I don't want to be chaste, but I want to be chaste.
Ah, yes, okay.
Okay. So then he says, I believe that desire pleases you. But ultimately, for Augustine and for other Christians, we would say our heart is so mixed up in sin, we can't want God in the kind of pure way that we need to want and worship him. Because we're always going to make it selfish. We're always going to make it about ourselves. And so transformation in Christianity is less taking a step in the right direction, and it's more like giving up. So you've been writing a lot about giving up recently. And becoming a Christian is more like quitting. It's more like saying, I can't do this. God, I need you to come to me, because I can't get to you. I can't get there. I can't even make the step. And so transformation is understood as it begins with God rescuing us and us responding to that rescue.
But what if God doesn't come and rescue you after you've given up? Like that just seems like, how does that work exactly? So let's say someone is just like, oh boy, I give up. And what if they don't feel God's presence? Help me understand that a bit more?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. This will probably need to be an extra podcast. But I think that what I would say to that person is what we know from scripture and history is much like the story you told. God is like a mother who loves her child and would do anything and has done everything for us. And so if you do not, if you have given up and you don't feel that presence, just know that, know and be a part of a community that knows that God does rescue and God is faithful and God is more faithful than we are. And that's where being a part of a community faith is really helpful, because if you're all alone, it's very difficult to know and feel that presence. But we understand that we know and experience God in community. And so...
and another question on that. So how does one give up? Because you could also see that in itself as a step. It is something that requires a kind of conscious choice on the part of the individual. They must decide to give up. There still is a sense of agency, is there not?
This is so fun, man. I love this podcast. This is so great. I'm so happy. So I think that for Christians, you keep using this word individual.
Maybe that's the effect of liberalism on me.
Yeah. Yeah. So for Christians, the line between individual human beings and God is a porous one. And so even in giving up, we would understand that God is active in our life, helping us give up. That there's never a moment where we are alone as an individual. There's never a moment where we make a decision completely by ourselves. God is always active in our lives. And you might not know that in the moment. Like, I don't mean to make an evangelical call to our listeners, but if you find yourself kneeling late at night before God and asking God for help, you might not recognize it in the moment, but days later you will recognize that God was actually moving in your heart, helping you to give up. You probably thought you made that decision all by yourself, that you took that step towards God in the moment. But later on, you will recognize that all along, God was helping you give up. God was helping you take that first step. And so part of living a godly life is recognizing that God has been with you since you were born. And so God brings you to this point. It's not that you, this autonomous individual, gather all the facts, reason it out, and decide, yes, clearly there is a God and I need to do these 5 things. And God is sitting there waiting for you. God's always pursuing, and you're porous, right? So God kind of invades you.
But if God is acting in all these ways and the line is porous, why isn't that having an effect on Trump? Like, what is the explanation for people who seem immune to God's power in this? Or that's probably not a good way of putting it, but they seem like they aren't being affected by God's interaction across the porous line. How do we explain that with someone like Trump or people who just never change?
Yeah, so like basic theodicy, like why doesn't God save everyone, right? Why doesn't God...
But not even saving them, but just...
Or change everyone, right? Yeah,
but yeah, so how do we...
I don't have an answer.
So how do we explain who is being changed by God and who isn't?
We don't. We don't explain that. And that would be an improper thing to explain.
No, but how do we make sense of it theologically?
This is a time of God's patience with the evil of the world, and God is being patient with humanity right now, and that's beyond my understanding, and that's part of why Christians will use a word called Maranatha, which means "Come, Jesus, come quickly," because sometimes we get really frustrated with God's patience, like. We want Jesus to come back and end the debate and end the suffering and end the injustice, and make every knee bow. Like we want every knee to go down, because we think that would lead to flourishing. But we live in a time of God's patience, and God is deciding not to do that with Donald Trump and with many others. So,
well, we don't know yet. Let's hope. There still is hope. I think.
Yeah, that's
if
right.
we want to end on a slightly positive note here, we don't know what is yet to come.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Hope springs eternal.
Yeah, and so, I wanted to close with this. It's one of my favorite little lines from G.K. Chesterton on optimism and pessimism. And I think it kind of captures, I'm excited for your article to come out, Shadi, in the Post, about your fantasizing about Donald Trump's, as you would say, fantasizing about his transformation as sort of a corrective to the catastrophizing that we've talked about. Like, everything is terrible. We're going to be destroyed. This is the end of democracy. This is the last election, all these sorts of things. So G.K. Chesterton is a Christian journalist, editorialist. You would just love his writing. He's very quotable.
He has great quotes and quips.
Yeah. So he's got one quote that I thought of as well that is very relevant to our time. He says, the quote is, he says, here it is. A change of opinions is almost unknown in an elderly military man. So, yeah, basically old men who fight a lot rarely change their mind. Obviously very relevant to the Donald Trump situation. He's not a military man. He famously did not go to Vietnam. But he's someone who's in the fight on a daily basis. And it's very difficult to change yourself when you're in a fighting position. When this is your posture, it's hard for you. And for those of you who are not watching on YouTube, I'm making fists, right? So when you're making fists, getting ready to fight, it's hard to have a posture of reception with open hands. And so Chesterton famously said, old military men don't change their minds.
So maybe then it's an exhortation to all of us and to all of you who are listening. Just stop fighting for a moment, or for more moments. I mean, Donald Trump won't be able to do that, unfortunately, so that makes me less hopeful. But all of us do have the ability to not always be in political battle, and to make choices to remove ourselves from the political battles that seem to be consuming American public life. And that is a conscious decision that each of us can make. We do have agency in that regard. No one is forcing you to be political all the time.
Indeed. So, but here's the Chesterton quote about optimism and pessimism.
Oh, there was still okay.
There's still more.
Quote.
There's still more Chesterton goodness. So, what Chesterton is battling back against in this section, he's saying we shouldn't be moderates. We shouldn't just be a little bit optimistic and a little bit pessimistic. He's talking to Christians here. He's actually arguing that Christians should be both deeply pessimistic and deeply optimistic. And he says, so here's the quote. No one doubts that an ordinary man can get on with this world, but we demand not strength enough to get on with it, but strength enough to get it on. Can a man hate the world enough to change it, and yet love the world enough to think it worth changing? Can you look up at the colossal good of the world without at once feeling acquiescence? And can you look up at the world's colossal evil without once feeling despair? Can you, in short, be at once not only a pessimist and an optimist, but a fanatical pessimist and a fanatical optimist? Is he enough? Can you be enough of a pagan to die for the world? That means a pagan in the sense of you really love the world. Can you love the world enough to die for it? And can you be a Christian enough to die to the world? So to sort of say it's not the whole thing. That's the pinch for the Christian faith, or just for citizenship, I would say, is like, can you love democracy and democratic politics enough to really engage with it, but not love it so much that you become obsessed with democratic politics in the way that you talk about, Shadi. So Chesterton
Amen.
says, it's in this combination, I maintain, that it's the rational optimist who fails and the irrational optimist who succeeds. He's ready to smash the whole universe for the sake of itself. So you're willing to smash America for its own sake. Like, you love America so much that you would destroy it. So you need to be able to have a deep optimism and a deep pessimism together. You have to, the other part of the quote is, you have to feel like the world is an ogre's castle that you need to charge, but also your home, like a cozy cottage. So you need to have both of those things at once. And we can see in American politics, honestly, the mistakes of citizens who see American politics as a castle that they have to charge, quite literally, on January 6th, right? I have to smash America to save it. Or this sort of acquiescence of, it's just my home that I love. And so, yeah, I really do. I look forward to your column, Shadi, and maybe we can share the link to it when it comes out. But yeah, to continue to think about, as citizens, how can we be hopeful for the transformation of our enemies and the change of our enemies, and how can we be reflective on our own fallenness, our own finitude, so that we might be the kinds of citizens, frankly, that we need.
Okay, well, that's a great note to end on. Very positive one. Well, kind of positive, I guess.
Both.
Yeah, both. So, thanks to all of you. I mean, before I just say thanks to our listeners, I just want to say I loved this episode. And granted, I like or love all of our episodes like children, I suppose. Like the hypothetical children that I don't have. But this one, okay, I feel rejuvenated. This is good. So thanks to Matt. Thanks to all of you for listening to Zealots at the Gate. If you like what you heard, you can always check out our other episodes and check out our host comment magazine at comment.org. And we do want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at Shadi Hamid. That's my handle. And Matthew Kaemingk, and note the Dutch spelling there at the end. Or you can use the hashtag ZealotsPod. Lastly, you can feel free to send us an email at zealots@comment.org, and we do look at those, and we always love to hear from you.
Our thanks to our sponsor, Fuller Seminary Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy, and editorial direction by Miss Ann Snyder. Until next time, friends, I'm Matthew Kaemingk.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Thanks for joining us.
See ya.